This is a story I wrote about a year ago for Paranormal Insider Radio, which is an online radio program created by the Paranormal Research Society, which is a society created by the Paranormal Investigation Team on A&E's Paranormal State. So I don't know if you're familiar with that. Writing about my experiences was actually very hard, and in the past I'd actually tried to write a more detailed account, but I creeped myself out too badly and I couldn't return to it. And so when I wrote this story for Paranormal State, or the Paranormal Insider Radio, it was kind of relieving and somewhat disappointing because I was writing about my childhood home, and my parents couldn't tell anybody that my story had been chosen because they were actually selling their home at that time. So, so I was a little disappointed. So this is the story. I call it Unsettled on the Prairie. I'm trying to get to the microphone. It was sometime during the middle months of 1978 that my parents moved into their newly built home. At the time, they had just 2 children, their 5-year-old fraternal twins, and their watchdog. Mom was pregnant with me due in January. As soon as they moved on to the lonely prairie in northern North Dakota, the feeling of being watched unsettled them. Their sleep became disturbed as they heard dishes moving throughout the night. They would often awake to the feeling of being smothered. They couldn't explain it, so they would shrug it off, but eventually it was unquestionable. The cars began to bounce. The lights would turn off. Mysterious glowing objects would move about the home. On one occasion, during an afternoon nap, my dad awoke to an unseen hand gripping onto his leg. Most undeniable was the evening that my uncle, his wife, and their young children came for a visit. Sometime during the night, they all awoke, and at first the scratching they heard on the window screens was faint, but it became loud and aggressive, and soon every window on the entire house was being violently scratched at. The dog was barking outside and thinking pranksters were up to this. They tore open the curtains, only to find the dog's frantic barking was at nothing. It eventually stopped, but it was the last time my uncle and his family would spend the night in our home. There was no way of knowing if these things had really happened. For all I knew, they were make-believe. When I heard that my sister had seen the head of a Native American moving across her basement, I refused to believe that too. To me, their accounts were impossible. Until I was 8 years old, I had never shared any of these terrifying experiences. But on that February night, the evening was alive with the sound of my father's guitar. At one time, he was a weekend guitarist in a local band. Now he continued to play at home in his spare time, and tonight his music carried loudly from his amplifier in the basement to the rest of the house. My younger sister and I had followed him down as usual to dance, to play tag, to sing along. The only time we were comfortable being in that area of the house ever, really, was when he was there too. The stairs were at the center of the floor, and we would circle around them again and again, past Dad and his guitar, past the wall that connected them, sometimes hiding under them as we waited to pounce out and scare each other. When Dad was there, we felt safe to be normal children. I had finally tired of our game of tag. I slowed to a walk and made my way under the stairs. But as I turned the corner and called out my younger sister's name, I stopped. There, in front of me, stood my sister, but there directly beside her stood another little girl, blonde and barefoot in a purple dress. My sister grabbed a toy and ran out of the room, never aware of what was there. I was overcome with fear as I watched the little girl cradle my teddy bear. Eventually, she too tired of her game. She set it down, somewhat hatefully, stepped to the side, and then disappeared. I was still holding my breath when I finally worked up the courage to run past the wall. To the upstairs with my mother. No more than 30 minutes later, my father, not knowing that I had seen anything at all, suddenly stopped playing. Something had caught his eye, and as he looked up from his guitar, he watched as a headless woman in a long dress disappeared near the same area of the house. Like many nights throughout our youth, that night we slept in one bedroom, all 7 of us, 2 parents and 5 kids. I never held my teddy bear again. I asked my parents to throw it away. Years later, an interesting story caught my attention. About a half a mile north of my parents' house is a group of homes that were built in the years following my parents' settlement onto the land. Our home was apparently on an area where a trading post once stood. The group of homes up the hill had apparently disturbed a Native American burial ground. Whatever the history was, one of the residents, not knowing my story, claimed that he too had seen the ghost of a little girl in a purple dress. Throughout the years, my experiences continued. Like my dad and my older brother, I seemed to be one of the family members who were more sensitive to the other side. On one occasion, I saw small black legs quickly squirm as though someone was trying to hide under my bed as I entered my room. Another time, what appeared to be my older sister bumped into me while I sat on a chair and then disappeared. I saw blue lights as opposed to the white lights my dad saw. And on one occasion, an object moved from a shelf 2 feet away from the bed onto the bed directly in front of me. Sometimes I heard my name being called. Sometimes, like most of us, I heard singing. And things always occurred when you least expected them. In the end, some occurrences hardly frightened me at all, but some stayed with me and are scary to recall even as an adult. The most horrifying experience wasn't mine, but took place when my older siblings were 5 years old. It was bizarre and almost unbelievable, but I know it's true. Every night as my brother lay alone in his bed in his new home, he would see a ball of green light in his closet. As a child, it didn't bother him, and he would watch with curiosity as it moved back and forth past a small gap between the closet doors until he fell asleep. On this night, however, as my brother watched it move, something different happened. This time, it paused in front of that gap and came out toward him and formed into the shape of a hand. My brother was in disbelief at what was next to his bed. And then he heard the low, grumbling voice. It was claiming ownership over the land, and it threatened to harm our family. My brother responded with threats of prayer. Angered, it invited my brother to watch as it moved to prove its power and left his room. My brother chased after it, down the hall to my sister's room, where he began to hear chanting. He watched as his twin sister, still sleeping, lifted into the air a few inches above her bed, turned and then dropped face down, never waking. As it turned its attention back to my brother ran to his own bed and hid under the covers. The chants were loud as my brother held tightly onto his bed and prayed. What happened next is unclear. He says he felt hundreds of needles pricking his back, but that he ended up escaping to the dining room where my parents were sitting with my grandparents. My mother knew he had not been in his bed long enough to be asleep. She believed it was not a dream. And as bizarre as that story is, I also believe it, for the idea of ghostly visitors is bizarre in itself, yet I myself have had those experiences. Back then it was life. Now I admit it feels like a sort of abuse when I remember the fear we all lived in and how much sleep I lost because of that fear. And there are so many more occurrences that I could tell you about that we could spend an entire evening doing so. I sometimes sense things as an adult in certain places, but I pray my children never have to suffer the sleeplessness I did as a child because of those experiences. About 6 years ago, our Catholic priest exorcised my parents' property, and it seemed the activity stopped. The house itself had a different feeling, a calm I'd never really felt in 20 years of living there, but I will say the area around the house never stopped making me uneasy. Perhaps they just agreed to leave our actual home alone while still retaining ownership over the land. After more than 30 years, my parents have moved and have sold their home to a young family. I find myself wondering, will the new owners and their young children be left in peace? Do the spirits really leave for good? Or did they eventually leave us alone only because we refused to be scared away? Will they attempt to stir up the new inhabitants? And if this happens, will the new family find their new home worth the fight?